Hey, Seth, welcome back to the show. Great to see you.
Good to be back, Sean. Remember the last time we did this? It was a fortuitous thing, given the outcome of the 2024 election.
It was. Uh, I remind people, not as probably as much as I should, but we nailed it on the show. 312 electoral votes. You did too. I want to get into this because the difference between me and you is this. I tell all the people all the time, I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I had a lot of smart people on the show like you who informed my decision making, whose basis for their analysis was rooted in data and trends and things like that. All I did was aggregate a bunch of smart people who I know in politics to tell me where things were, but you were one of those people. And I think, I get a kick out of this, and I want to start so people understand where we're headed. Let's talk a little bit about the past, because I think too many times in politics, an election happens and everyone moves on, and we don't look at what went well and what didn't. So I want to start with that. Then I want to get into the midterms, and we'll go to the House and the Senate. So let's start with the past. Leading up to this election, media outlets called you an election denier, forecasting the race, and dismissed your methods. And so I just want to start with this. When the dust settled, you were perfect. 56 out of 56 jurisdictions. And what does that mean? That means, obviously all 50 states, DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, like all of our territories. And 300 electoral votes for Trump, 226 for Harris. I want to start with this. As from a personal standpoint, how cool was it when you woke up and said, yep, nailed it?
It was really cool, and of course it took forever to call Arizona because it's a third the size of Florida, but it takes 2 weeks to count the vote. But I knew that Arizona was going to go in the bag. But the 56 races, we're talking about the states plus DC, and then the 5 split electoral votes of Maine and Nebraska. So to look back and get all that right, some of them were tough. Nebraska's second district is a tough call. It's almost a coin flip, and so was New Hampshire. We talked about it right here on the show. I knew that the voter registration file for New Hampshire showed a tight race, even though the polling showed it somewhere off in the stratosphere. So it was cool. And it was vindication in a way, where the New York Times wrote this piece and made me out to look like some end of level boss. And here I am, they're mocking all the polling versus my picks, and it's all correct. Now, presidential elections are easily predictable based on history, but my methodology was based on traditional political analysis, light on polling, but it was also something that included an analysis of the laws that have changed since 2015 that allow for manipulation of election results and therefore push some states that should be competitive into permanent blue state status and make other red states tougher to win.
Was there anything in the final results that surprised you? Something that was closer or a bigger victory than you thought?
Absolutely. President Trump was on an interview last week, and he was discussing the election results. And the interviewer said, she got 75 million votes, talking about the need to have unity in the country. And he kind of shrugged it off. And that's what my analysis picks up too. She only outgained Joe Biden in 6 of 50 states. And they happened to be states that either had very important congressional races or they were critical battleground states for electoral votes. She lagged Biden's totals in New York and California by 15+% in each. And California, of course, is her home state. It suggests to me that a lot of the ballot harvesting and packing was relaxed in some of the reliable red and blue states. And that's where we got the distortion of the numbers from 2020 to 2024. There are a number of Senate races that concern me and some House races as well. This is why we have such a small Republican majority in addition to the redistricting that was forced upon these GOP states by courts, but not in blue states.
What was the delta in some of these places between your model and some of the quote unquote polling?
Most of my picks were within a couple points. Some of them were right on the nose. Some of them were within a tenth of a point, like in Montana. Some of the states I think that were closer than I expected to be, like New Jersey would be a great example. New Jersey finished within 6 points. Then there were some states that were further off than I thought they would be. Trump was a little bit further off in Virginia than I expected him to be. Minnesota, he was a little bit further off in Minnesota than I expected, which of course is dominated by the Twin Cities. But the biggest surprise to me, pro-Trump surprise, was Texas, where Texas is a state that everybody's been watching. It's got a big suburban college educated population where people have been watching these margins go from 15 to 9 to 5.5. And then Trump won it by more than 13 points, almost 14-point victory in Texas. So that is a big feather in the cap for a populist America First model, because it's not going to exist without Texas and its energy production and its base of social conservatism. So that was the best pro-Trump surprise. There were states that I didn't think he would win, like New Jersey, because of the types of laws that they have in the state that make it difficult for any Republican to win.
Has there been any? So let's just start with this. What made you different when people look and say, "Wow, you nailed it"? Why is your model better than? I mean, aside from being more accurate, but it's almost like, what's the secret sauce that makes what you do better than a lot of the other pundits and analysts?
It's what you would expect from an intelligence officer's mind. Now, of course, you're a military officer as well, and you mentioned that you have access to all these smart people and all these tools in your drawer, and that's exactly the essence of leadership in the military officership. Using the people that you have at your disposal, your staff, to get work done. So my model is a bit like an intelligence analyst toolkit. We used to have these wheels we would draw for pattern analysis. We would have data sheets. We'd have spreadsheets. We'd have ability to work data any way possible. Maps, of course. So with me, do I ignore polling? Not completely. But I think that polling is a bit of a lost art, like the stolen base or the hit and run. And I think that polling would be a lot better if it was more selective. So if you want to give me an accurate poll of Arizona, why don't you poll Pima County and tell me where the Republican is in Pima County? And if you get him somewhere in the low to mid 40s, you've got a Republican win brewing in the state, rather than these massive polls. And nationwide polls now, especially thanks to the polarization of the electoral college, are extremely worthless. In fact, a month before the election, the mainstream media tried to run a narrative that Harris would lose the popular vote and win the electoral college, which doesn't work, given that the current shift in the national politics is a working class shift favoring the right. So my model will also consider, it may look at some polling down at the smallest level, but voter registration by party, which was very accurate. My numbers that I wrote as a final summary was 86% accurate in determining right or left at the county level. And most of these misses were in massive red counties where it's R plus 88 versus R plus 87. So it's statistical noise. And then I've got historical precedent. A great example of that would be polling of Nevada versus Arizona. So whenever I would see a poll showing Trump likely to win Nevada but lose Arizona, I would automatically discount the poll. Why? Because I have over 100 years of history that tells me that that's not correct, because Arizona's been a state since 1912. And Arizona has never voted Democrat for president while Nevada voted Republican. It has never happened. So I suppose that there is a time in history where this could happen, where Nevada's Republican and Arizona goes blue, but it hasn't happened yet in 112 years of presidential politics. So I'm not going to put my money on it now. So that's one example of how I sort these states out. Or states like Minnesota and Wisconsin. I would have advised President Trump to not even spend a nickel in Minnesota, because it's going to wind up to the left of Wisconsin no matter what, because history suggests that's what always happens. So if you do carry Minnesota, you would have already won Wisconsin anyway. So that means you need to go after Wisconsin, because most people would have had you as the presidential victor with Wisconsin in your quiver. And that's the truth.
So, and just real quick on that case. So if you were up in Minnesota, would you even want to spend time in Wisconsin? I mean, to me, on your analysis, it would be, hey, if you're winning Minnesota, you got Wisconsin, right?
Correct. But the point is, all your assets should go into Wisconsin, because you're not going to somehow win Minnesota but lose Wisconsin. You'll drag Minnesota with you if you win Wisconsin big enough.
So I see. Okay.
And this is how I felt about Virginia. When people were saying we need to go campaign in Virginia, it's like, no, you need to make sure you campaign in Georgia and Pennsylvania and hold all the other states like North Carolina, then you'll win, because the objective is 270 to win.
Right. So what do we learn from voter registration? Meaning, there's a lot of folks that have always said, people who register right off the bat, we don't have any voter reg on them. We don't have any voter history on them. So what do we know now, especially after the last few cycles, about people who are newly registered to vote?
So new voter registration is the biggest indicator of intent to vote. And if you're registering, let's just take you back to 2008. So if you get a voter registration in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, from a 23-year-old black woman registering to vote for the first time, then should probably be lobotomized if you don't have her down for a surefire Barack Obama vote. Okay, that's intent. So, or if you're in a state like, well, let's use Pennsylvania again, Western Pennsylvania in 2016, and you've never voted, but now you register to vote right before the Republican primary, you're probably out there to support Trump in the working class realignment, but definitely going into the general election, registering Republican. That's a surefire indicator. In some places, we have the reverse, like in in states like Northern Virginia. You don't have party registration, but you have a lot of former Republican voters that switch sides and now vote for the party that is going to bloat the federal bureaucracy. So the voter registration doesn't pick up a lot of these party shifts, and they change over time. So that's where sometimes you might get a miss. But overall, with a larger sample, 67 counties in Pennsylvania, 67 counties in Florida, they all shifted more Republican in registration, and they all followed more Republican in the vote. In Arizona, it was 15 for 15. In New Hampshire, it was 10 for 10. Now, these other states that I brought up in question for 2024 results, they were far less accurate. Pennsylvania was only 54 out of 67, for instance. But you look at the party registration file, new registrations signal intent and enthusiasm. This is why more states that bring in automatic voter registration distorts the accuracy of these models, because they automatically register voters who may not intend to vote. And of course, the more you flood out mail-in balloting and ballot harvesting, that can change these things too. So I would encourage people to look at the accuracy of the models, which I've parsed these out, and they're extremely accurate. 30 states register voters by party, and they all became more Republican except for one, and that was Colorado. But Colorado actually became more Republican in the vote.
Interesting. So as we look going forward at polling, and we see the head-to-head or issues of public polls in our, in news outlets, why should we be like, how should we just overall be skeptical of them? Are they doing things fundamentally wrong? Is the model flawed? Is it all the above?
Polling is ultimately just a tool, and it's neither good nor bad in its own. It is something that can be manipulated, like we saw with Ann Seltzer's poll of Iowa a couple days before the election. Of course, our friend Newt Gingrich took my estimates of that poll and ripped it apart on Mark Halperin's show. But polling can be manipulated like that, where all the fundamentals in Iowa were 99 counties are all more Republican by registration than they were last time. And by the way, 98 of 99 counties became more Republican in the vote this past year in Iowa. So polling can be manipulated, but ultimately it's a tool. And even good pollsters like Richard Barris or Robert Cahaley over at Trafalgar Group, those guys even have a margin of error of a couple points, maybe 2 or 3 points. That means that you can be wrong 2 points to the left or 2 points to the right and still be right based on the margin of error. And 2% in Pennsylvania is 140,000 votes of margin. So it's what it really should be used for by candidates is for, let's say you're running for governor of Florida and you order a poll of the state of Florida. It should be telling you where you're strong and where you're weak in the state, where you should be allocating funds. So if people use polling as the end all be all of I'm winning or I'm not winning, they're not counting votes. And ultimately it's a count of ballots at the end, where you're getting them from. And whether you're operating one of these models where, and this is a good example from the fight in 2024, is fundamentally, if you're a baseball coach, you don't want to train your hitters to swing with an uppercut because it creates a big hole in the swing. However, a lot of guys have a natural uppercut and they hit a lot of home runs. So naturally, I don't think that early voting and mail-in balloting is a best practice for election security. However, I understand why President Trump encouraged everyone to vote early, because that deprived the media of a needed narrative that Harris is up by this much in this state, she's up by this many ballots in Arizona, and that gives you a narrative to pull off a 2020 again. That was deprived from them, and they did not know how to respond to that. So, but either way, your count of ballots is what matters, not your polling averages. So polling can probably tell you not to compete in Massachusetts Senate race. I think that that's fair. But if you believed in polling wholeheartedly, Trump would never show up in Wisconsin because it's a very hard state to poll. One reason that Richard Barris has put out for Wisconsin is that the vast northern region, which is massively MAGA, is very difficult to physically reach. They don't have landlines. Cell phone service is very sporadic. People don't trust pollsters anyway. People have response bias, especially in the age of Trump, where in the early days, people didn't want to admit they were going to vote for Trump. And even to a total stranger on the line, they would say they were voting for the other guy. So you get errors like that aren't even from polling dishonesty. And then you have the other problem where somebody's actually sponsoring the poll, and they're not cheap. These good polls are at least 10 grand. And you've got people that are sponsoring a poll and would like to show a certain narrative, and that happens too. So I think it's a tool. I think that you can create a picture of turnout based on historical precedent, based on voter registration, and based on any particular issues that might motivate the bases in these counties. And ultimately, 3,143 counties and independent cities in the United States determine our elections.
That's right. In your newsletter, you said something that sort of piqued my interest and made me smile, because you talk about, and this is my segue into the midterms, because you talk about election season as an enduring thing that never really ends. It's kind of like how the NFL season proliferates itself through the calendar in unique ways. So you wrote, regular season runs from the beginning of September to January. Okay, I get that. That's your final push, election day, and then the transition. Playoffs and Super Bowl take place in January and February. Pro Bowl combines and NFL Combine take place in February and March. The NFL draft plays, mini camps, training camps. And then you talk about how that plays out with respect to election, where early voting begins in September, runs through October and November. Election day is November. Election counting and challenges take place in November and election. Election winners seated by the end of January. Candidates begin filing for future races in February. Campaigns begin hiring in the spring. Election season begins. I mean, you're right. It's like a season that never ends.
It's like the NFL season. It's you can go to any Buffalo Wild Wings in America and look up at the TV bank over the bar, and there's NFL coverage right there. And of course, this is a business model. But I remember, I'm only 40, and I remember being a kid, and when baseball season went off after the World Series, it was this darkness until February when people reported to spring training. But now, of course,
catchers report. Right.
With more access to information and more revenue channels, of course, this extends. But there is no sport that is more continuous than the NFL. And the same thing is true with elections. They never end. And of course, the media benefits from this too, because it's the polarization and the headbutting, the constant narratives of, well, Donald Trump had chocolate ice cream tonight. How's that going to affect the midterms?
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.